Hello, I'm Lana Moran, President of Amnesty International Canada, welcoming you on behalf of the National Board of Directors. Looking back on 2017, it is clear that so much good work has been done, and yet many human rights struggles continue. Fortunately, Amnesty Canada members and supporters were more than engaged than ever. The Board of Amnesty Canada works closely with senior management in tracking the organization's progress work made towards our ambitious goals laid out in the 4-year branch plan, which we call Vision 2020. We strive to focus our resources strategically for the greatest human rights impact, both domestically and globally. In this video, you will hear from Alex Neve, Amnesty's Secretary General, and Jane Stoyles, Amnesty's Executive Director. They will share key information regarding our work over this past year. Although much work remains, we are getting results. On behalf of the organization, thank you for supporting Amnesty Canada. Your involvement is essential to our work. Be it activism, volunteer time, or financial contribution, we truly could not do this work without your commitment. Thank you.
There's no other way to say it. This has not been an easy time for human rights. At the same time, it has been such a powerful and important time to be part of Amnesty International and, of course, to be part of the wider community of individuals right across Canada and around the world who are standing up for human rights in these difficult times. Not easy because the world is facing waves of conflict and turmoil and a rise in the politics of hate and demonization in so many countries, and all of that challenges human rights at its very core. But Amnesty International has been there at the front lines of these very challenging situations. That has certainly included doing everything we can to expose the terrible human rights violations that we see in the midst of situations of war, conflict, and atrocities right around the world. The terrible situation in Syria continues. The conflict in South Sudan has taken such a terrible toll. The war in Yemen rarely makes the front pages of newspapers. And this past year, of course, the surge in violence, the terrible atrocities in Myanmar led to unprecedented attacks against the Rohingya people. And we've also been there in other situations of terrible human rights abuses, such as the ongoing terrible situation that the Palestinian people face in the occupied territories and the deep, terrible human rights crisis in Venezuela. And very importantly, you have been there, signing petitions, writing letters, standing in solidarity, demanding that refugees be saved, that civilians be protected, that human rights defenders be able to do their work in safety. We have also responded to the rise in a wave of the politics of hate and demonization and bigotry over this past year. This is, of course, very much about Donald Trump, but not only Donald Trump. But we certainly have actively followed and responded, taking action with respect to the wave of hate-filled executive orders signed by Donald Trump, unleashing the Muslim ban, the effort to build that wall, action against transgender individuals, rolling back of sexual reproductive rights for women around the world, and so many other measures, and we will continue to do that. But don't think that this is only about Donald Trump, because this is a phenomena that Amnesty International is documenting right around the world, be it the war on drugs, which is really a war on the poor that Rodrigo Duterte has unleashed in the Philippines, be it the terrible war on refugees unleashed by Hungary's Viktor Orban. This is not an isolated instance. Russia, India, Turkey, so many other countries. We are there, certainly documenting the abuses, insisting that people, societies, leaders, and people like Donald Trump and Putin and Modi and Erdogan and Duterte change the channel on hate and return to a politics of tolerance, diversity, and inclusion. Amidst all of this, particularly at risk have been the brave individuals right around the world who do everything they can to defend human rights, and do so at a time when it is becoming increasingly dangerous and perilous. That's why we have mounted our Global Human Rights Defenders campaign to stand with those individuals in the important work they do. And that may include women human rights defenders who are taking brave action, for instance, as the women who lead the campaign against disappearances in Mexico do. Or it may mean individuals who stand up for the land and the environment in the face of natural resource projects. And that certainly includes land and environmental defenders in countries like Honduras and Guatemala, who often speak up and draw attention to serious concerns associated with natural resource projects, which frequently involve powerful Canadian economic interests. This past year, we learned that the dangers that human rights defenders face around the world can get very personal with us in Amnesty International. Two of our top leaders of Amnesty International in Turkey were both imprisoned simply because they speak out for human rights in the course of their work. The chair of Amnesty International Turkey, Taner Hilic, and the director of Amnesty International Turkey, Idil Eser, were both imprisoned. Idil was released after over 3 months, but the trial against her continues. But Taner, close to 1 year later, remains behind bars. Right around the world in unprecedented numbers, we, you, all of us, mobilized on their behalf, and we will continue to do so until those charges are dropped and until both Taner and Idil are free at last. One issue connects both of these big global concerns about conflict and demonization, and that's the global refugee crisis we face. Unprecedented numbers right around the world, and of course over the past year with close to 700,000 Rohingya fleeing from Myanmar into Bangladesh, those numbers continued to rise. But the crisis, don't be fooled, doesn't lie in the numbers. The crisis doesn't lie in the refugees. The crisis lies in the terrible, restrictive, punitive, mean-spirited measures that are pursued by states, more often determined to keep refugees away than to ensure they receive the protection that is their basic right. That is why we have launched our I Welcome Refugee campaign right around the world, and that will continue to be at the forefront of our human rights work over the year to come. Amidst this troubling and volatile international context, there have both been considerable ups and also some very disappointing downs when it comes to human rights closer to home here in Canada. Certainly, the Trudeau government has made some stirring promises and pursued some necessary changes with respect to protection of the rights of Indigenous peoples in Canada. For instance, having now committed to finally taking action to implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in Canadian law. However, we remain deeply disappointed that the Trudeau government, now joined by the new provincial government in British Columbia, in fact, refuse to take action to stop construction of the Site C Dam in northeastern British Columbia, where First Nations people have made it very clear that they do not want it, the construction of which now stands to destroy vast swaths of their traditional territory and really is an affront to this notion that Canada has full regard for the rights of Indigenous peoples. That struggle has now turned to the courts, and we will continue with that campaign. We are not going to relent. At the same time, the national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls continues, something, of course, that Amnesty International had campaigned for well over a decade. We continue to stand with Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people in their quest for justice, and that includes calling on the federal government to take action now, even while the inquiry is underway, because much of what we need to do to ensure safety and protection for Indigenous women and girls in Canada is well known, and we cannot continue to delay action to address those concerns. There has been tremendous progress in many areas this past year. We welcomed, for instance, the launch of the federal government's new feminist international assistance policy, a tremendous indication that regard for women's human rights will now be at the very center of Canada's approach to international aid and development. We celebrated the fact that Bill C-16 entered into force last year. Those are the reforms to the Canadian Human Rights Act and the Criminal Code that will now dramatically strengthen protection of the rights of transgender individuals in Canada. And we were ecstatic in January of this year when, after more than a decade of campaigning by Amnesty International and our allies, the government announced that there will finally now be an ombudsperson to oversee the actions of Canadian extractive companies right around the world, addressing the long-standing concern that sadly far too often Canadian mining, oil and gas companies find themselves embroiled in situations of terrible human rights violations, and that we need measures to guard against that. We were deeply disappointed that promises to finally get on board with global efforts to do something about the arms trade, always an awful contributor to human rights violations, war and atrocities around the world, remained, to say the least, unconvincing. That included the refusal still to call a halt to the sale of $15 billion worth of light armored vehicles to the Saudi military, a military that is leading a coalition responsible for war crimes and other grave human rights violations amidst the ongoing war in Yemen. And that also includes the concerns about Canada's approach to finally signing on to the UN Arms Trade Treaty, doing so on the basis of legislation which includes a gaping hole. And that is that it will not apply to arms sales from Canada to the United States. That's more than half of Canadian arms sales going to a country that by no means intends, in the short term at least, to sign on to the treaty itself, and a country which has a notorious record of selling and transferring arms to governments all over the world, despite their terrible human rights record. We were also deeply troubled that the important encouraging moves that we've seen from the Canadian government over the last couple of years with respect to refugee protection faded away very quickly when tested along the Canada-US border. As more and more refugees turned north, looking to Canada for protection in the face of restrictive, punitive measures in the United States under Donald Trump, they found that border closed because of a 14-year-old treaty, the Safe Third Country Agreement, which has compelled them instead to make irregular border crossings, not at official border posts, and often doing so amidst situations of considerable danger and peril. We've pressed repeatedly for Canada to suspend, at least temporarily, this agreement so that human rights and protection of refugees will prevail along that border, but they've refused to do so, so we've joined with our allies and are challenging this agreement in court. Freedom has been won over this past year. Freedom won often after very long struggles. And I want to remind all of us in particular that freedom was won for 3 Canadians whose cases were of deep concern for Amnesty International, and many of you likely signed petitions or wrote letters on their behalf. Last July, we welcomed freedom for Pastor Hyun Soo Lim, freed after more than 2.5 years of imprisonment in North Korea. In January of this year, it was freedom for Hassan Diab after more than 3 years behind bars without charge or trial on spurious, unfounded allegations of responsibility for a terrorist attack in France. And just this April, freedom for Bashir Maktal after over 11 years of a life sentence in Ethiopia, where he'd been imprisoned after a deeply unfair trial. Throughout these difficult and challenging times, with the ups and the downs, we were there, you were there, Amnesty International was there, demanding that prisoners be freed, demanding that human rights defenders be given safety, demanding that communities be protected, demanding that unjust laws be reformed. It has been a difficult year, but that does not mean that the Amnesty International candle has dimmed. Quite the contrary. We have known that that candle this past year has had to burn even brighter than ever, and it will continue to do so with your help.
So I'm going to turn to some of the operational elements of 2017, including our financial situation and the outcomes in various fundraising programs, a look at how we're spending money, our structure and staffing, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and a brief check-in on how we're doing against our Vision 2020 strategic goals. So we'll start by taking a look at the financial health of the branch. At the end of 2017, the net worth of the branch was $2.63 million. That represents a decrease of $0.422 million because of an approved deficit, and that was an investment in fundraising to support the future financial health of the branch. As supporters will know, the Closer to the Ground movement that is moving some of our Amnesty offices around the world and out of London for the International Secretariat, that has increased the annual financial contribution of medium and large size sections. So we need to grow in order to meet that commitment and continue with our own branch-led programs, as well as contributing to the growth agenda of the movement to increase our supporter base. And so all of that requires an additional investment, including in fundraising, and that was the reason for the deficit in 2017. So we raised $13,453,000 against our budget of $13,740,000, and that represents a growth of 1% in revenue over the year before. So we did very well. Programs other than legacies all exceeded their targets, and that raised about $700,000 more than in previous years. So we're going to take a look here at revenue according to the various fundraising programs. These are highlights of how the various programs did. If you look here, the monthly program recruited over 7,000 new donors, and the retention rates increased significantly. Annual giving had a strong year, raising more than in the past couple of years. Major gifts grew by about 20% over the previous year. Digital fundraising continued to grow and brought in more than $1 million, and we raised more than $100,000 for the Hud Bay litigation cases as a special project, and that was to support the 13 Guatemalan litigants who are suing the Canadian mining company, and that's a case in which we're also involved. So if we take a look, I mentioned that the Legacies program was the one that did not meet its target. The Legacies were budgeted at $1,250,000 and came in about $300,000 short of that. But the good news is that that was considered largely a matter of timing with Canada Revenue Agency processing. We have 282 new prospects in 2017. That was with a target of 200. And 103 confirmations of being in a will, and the target that we had for that was 75. So we are exceeding the targets in the Legacies program, and we've started 2018 with more Legacies in the pipeline than we have ever had in the past. So that program is doing well, despite having been to some extent responsible for the deficit for last year. So if we take a look at our expenses, how we've spent this money, the expenses for 2017 were $14.1 million, and that's an increase of about $0.05 million from the prior year, and the expenses were all undertaken within the approved budget from the board. Most of the increase in expenses was in fundraising costs, and I explained that need to make those additional investments. There was also a slight increase in expenses to support branch operations, fairly insignificant, and an insignificant decrease in program expenses. We sent over $3.5 million to the International Secretariat for its international projects. Of every dollar raised in 2017, that breaks down into spending 59 cents on programs, 10 cents on operating costs, and 35 cents to do our fundraising. And our cost of fundraising increased only 2.6 cents for every dollar, which is considered quite good given that there is increased competition for fundraising across various causes. This is another slide on expenses that just gives a breakdown visually of how the expenses broke down in various programs. I won't go through it all. I'll just mention grassroots activism. That means our campaign, our branch-led campaign work. And this slide gives you a brief visual representation of our fundraising revenue versus expenses in the different programs. So again, giving you a sense that the monthly giving program is the strongest revenue generator. That's through face-to-face canvassing at doors and on street corners. And then if you look at this other chart that shows you that that was also the largest chunk of our expenses for fundraising, and the comparisons between the other programs as well. You can take a closer look at that slide if you'd like to really see that breakdown. So I'd like to talk briefly about some of the structural and staffing changes. We had, at the end of the year, with lots of fluctuations throughout the year, we had 52 staff in 4 main offices. The offices, of course, are in Ottawa, Toronto, Vancouver, and with 1 person in Calgary. And that represents 40 full-time staff and 12 part-time staff. I did want to mention that the Director of Programs and Communications, Alain Roy, left near the beginning of 2017, and we have not replaced that position for now. That is in order to shore up staffing in other areas that were cut when we downsized some years ago, when we first recognized the need to contribute more to the international movement and make some adjustments here. So rather than replacing at the director level, we did decide to increase some of the staffing capacity, but we hope to revisit that because it certainly is a gap that is being felt. The other fairly significant change was the campaigns and activism team being brought under 1 programs manager, that's Hilary Holmes. The executive assistant role was also brought back to 1 full-time position from a job share that was more like about 1.5 positions, and that's just one of a number of measures like that we're taking to try to streamline costs. We added a 3rd regional fundraiser in Ottawa, the others being in Vancouver and Calgary. And at year end, we had 14 posted positions that had been filled, 2 more job postings that were underway, and 3 planned for the beginning of this year in 2018. So it was quite a significant year for recruitment, including all the toll that takes and capacity, and the need to get people oriented and for other team members to support that in the meantime. So let's talk a little bit about our work on diversity, equity, inclusion. So some years ago, the board requested that a priority in our diversity work be placed on gender mainstreaming, including in all of our programming and how it's run. And so in 2017, we did have gender equality training workshops that were offered for all staff. Some of those were introductory and others were refreshers. But we're now trying to broaden this lens. And so we were having those conversations at the end of 2017 to offer a broader anti-oppression training and broader anti-oppression lens to all of our work. So in 2017, we got started with that by offering the board anti-oppression training to support its governance role. And plans were made to offer this to all staff and managers in 2018, and that has now begun. We also are placing an emphasis in diversity in staff hiring. A policy review is underway with an anti-oppression lens as a next priority. And to support all of this, at the end of 2017, we issued a call for membership in a diversity, equity, and inclusion steering committee. That committee was recruited by some of our longstanding volunteer board members with expertise in this area from involvement in the global movement and who have also been board members. We have the committee in place now and developing its work plan. And it's important to note that there is, in fact, an increased commitment on the part of the movement to diversity work with a resolution that was passed last summer. So we'd like to take a minute or so to do a brief check-in on where we are with our Vision 2020 strategic goals. The first area of our work is, of course, our human rights impact, which you have heard a lot about, but just in summary version in terms of how well on track we are contributing well to the international strategic goals as we've committed to. We are effectively having input on both our depth and breadth areas of work. And just a reminder that Vision 2020 notes that we will dedicate specialized campaign expertise and cross-cutting strategies and activities in 5 main areas. That's the rights of Indigenous people, business and human rights, gender rights, individuals at risk, including human rights defenders, and response to other human rights crises. So we are doing well in all of those areas. And that includes making a strong contribution to the IS-driven priorities like crisis that arise and individuals at risk that the IS identifies, as well as our own branch-led work. In terms of our supporter growth targets, there's so much that we could say here that supports the achievement of those goals. There's always, of course, an enormous number of events across Canada to educate, train, and engage people, and you've heard about some of those. We had 1,500 Right for Rights events across the country. New roundtables were launched in various urban centers, and as well we had an online version of the roundtable this year that was to engage people who are not based in one of the major urban centers. Our number of youth and student groups increased. We had the launch of a young professionals network and a youth cafe. New local organizers and youth organizers recruited. One of the innovative ways that we are reaching more students in more schools was a tour with Sean Booth, who is a well-known rapper. And then we had quite a number of digital strategies that are really considered some of the leading edge strategies within the movement to increase engagement with Amnesty. Just a couple of highlights: a new urgent action app that was launched, and very innovative online action forms that allow us to do things like directly writing to MPs, and then also increase the ability to share those easily to get them to other people. We purchase lists to reach out to new audiences and then follow up with them. We do quite a lot with social media to increase the organic reach of our social media and reach friends of friends. We use paid advertising. We boost things through social media and use lead ads. And our list of email subscribers, to which we send very regular updates, grew by over 43,000 to almost 300,000 people. And we had 113,000 people taking action. And that's against the goal of reaching 350,000 different people by 2020, having them take action annually. So we do have a long way to go there. And in 2018, we have quite a number of new strategies, processes, and structures that we're looking at to try to reach that target. So we've talked a lot about fundraising, won't go through that again, but to note that the Vision 2020 target is 16 million. And that's about $1 million that we need to increase every year. The target for 2018 is just under $14.5 million that we intend to raise. We feel that's ambitious, but certainly possible. And in terms of our visibility, there aren't specific targets in Vision 2020 except to say that we want to be a leading voice, and that includes increasing the visibility of Amnesty. Again, so much of what we've already talked about helps to meet those goals. We have a strong and growing social media presence. We always have a target for meeting op-eds and for placing op-eds. We had a target of 15 with about 3 or 4 per quarter, and that was met. We do such significant media work, as I'm sure you will have seen. Our digital ads on Facebook and Google are also helping us to meet people who would not normally be looking for Amnesty content. And then, as I mentioned, we invest in boosting social media posts as well as doing general public engagement campaigns like the 2 mentioned here, Nothing to See Here and Cause Change, that we invested in at the end of the year. So just to give you an example of their reach, 18 million people were reached on Google and 2.7 million on Facebook through the Nothing to See Here campaign. So as always, it feels like there's so much more that we could say, but that gives you a snapshot of the operations in 2017. And on behalf of the board, the senior management, and the staff, I just really want to offer our deepest thanks to all of you who contribute to the realization of what was highlighted at the beginning with our human rights impact, and to all of the other things that we're trying to do to have Amnesty be as effective as possible in human rights change. We had a wonderful year in 2017, and we thank you so much for your contributions.